Which Tekken game is the best? Is it the OGs like Tekken 1 and 2, or the innovative Tekken 3? Maybe it's the daring tag spin-offs with their gigantic rosters. No matter what you choose, there are no bad answers. Tekken is a franchise that has been lucky enough to have an incredible record when it comes to quality games. Even Tekken Revolution has something interesting to offer, despite being a free-to-play asset flip that tried to recoup the disastrous sales of Tekken Tag 2. Only one game is omitted, more often than not, when talking about the bests or favorites, and that game is Tekken 4. Even though many people seem to be warming up to it over the years, that was not at all the case on release or long after it. In today's video, we want to not so much focus on what people hated, but rather highlight some of the unique things that Tekken 4 has going for it, things that are still worth appreciating. As usual, before we begin, please consider dropping a sub if you end up enjoying the video. Thank you. Context is of great importance when talking about Tekken 4. After all, the circumstances surrounding the game played a key role in creating its reputation. Tekken as a series was on a roll in the 90s. It was a hit after hit after hit after hit. It was non-stop great games that only got better. This meant two things: the fans had great expectations from the sequel, and that the developers were under severe pressure to deliver a game that would live up to those expectations. Harada was still quite early into his development career back then, only serving as a director on Tekken 3 and Tag Tournament. Nonetheless, he rose up to the challenge, aiming to deliver exactly what Tekken fans wanted. To achieve this, he did something unusual. Namco ran a global survey asking people what they wanted to change. As he pointed out in the recent episode of Harada's Bar, when you do this, you only get negative responses. People complain about too many characters, too many combos, how there's too much to learn, and they even complain about the announcer being too energetic, which is why there's such a stark contrast between Tekken 3 and 4 announcers.
The King of Iron Fist Tournament. Enter the Tekken.
Welcome to the King of Iron Fist Tournament 4.
Naturally, some of them also didn't like that Tekken 1, 2 and 3 were too similar to each other. Their feedback was taken to heart, but when Tekken 4 came out, well, turns out it was now too different. Some didn't even consider it as a real Tekken game. Those differences sealed the game's fate. Namco even cancelled their plans for a new version of Tekken 4. However, those differences also resulted in one of the most interesting and unique entries in the franchise. So let's dive into why. The defining element of Tekken 4 is its presentation. This is where the game outshines all its contemporaries and arguably still compares favorably to fighting games that came after it. Namco managed to squeeze out a great image out of the PS2, but it's not just about the fidelity. There's a strong sense of style to it, a specific sort of atmosphere that it wanted to pursue. It becomes self-evident when you look at the art of Tekken 4. It's worth noting that this is the first game in the franchise to prominently feature stylized drawings, unlike most other Tekken games that relied on 3D renders and animation for their marketing and storytelling. It allowed us to get a more expressive version of the characters and the world around them. It's very rough, sketchy and grimy. It painted a more grounded and moody picture of the Tekken's world, and the rest of the game very much followed this direction. For the first and really the only time in the franchise, Paul wasn't just a joke character. Instead of the usual midhead with a crazy haircut, we are greeted with a disgraced champion, a sad washout who was robbed of the glory he was so eager to achieve. King also had a surprisingly dark story where the entire premise is that he plots a revenge murder against the killer of his master. Not every character was going through doom and gloom, but the general direction for the story was a lot more serious. To this day, Tekken 4 has a greater focus on the characters outside of the Mishima saga than perhaps any other game in this series. Death by degrees notwithstanding.
Not a bad view.
The art and story do a good job of setting the tone, but what really ties it all together is a feature that would become a staple for Tekken: full 3D stages. While previous games had some gorgeous backdrops for you to fight in front of, Tekken 4 took it to a whole new level. Unlike the flat circles and squares that came after it, Tekken 4 chose to instead double down on the grounded atmosphere of the game. You were fighting in the streets and throwing your opponents into phone booths that shattered in a million pieces. You could have a fight in a parking lot of some apartment complex where you have to navigate around the pillars. Or how about a tiny underground fight ring where you could accidentally hit one of the bystanders? And of course there's the massive and still fantastic looking mall where you could explore every nook and cranny. Tekken 4 dared to do what nobody else would try, and it gave us stages that look alive, stages that feel like real places. Unfortunately, yes, it did undermine the competitive aspect of the game. Introducing elevation, obstacles and breakable objects was bound to create some issues, but if you only play the game casually, all of those things are kind of fun. Not only did it add more variety, but this connection to mundane real-life places also added contrast that helped to highlight the superhuman action that you see in Tekken. Even the soundtrack had to change in order to achieve this, though funnily enough it did so by going back to Tekken's roots. While 2, 3 and Tag Tournament had character teams, Tekken 1 had stage teams. The best approach is down to preference, but when you are aiming to create a rich atmosphere, it helps to have a soundtrack that builds from and enhances the visuals. Just look at the beach stage. Without the iconic Peach track, it simply would not be the same. Tekken 4 on a mechanical level may forever be a letdown. It's a game that tried to distance itself from much of what we currently associate with the franchise. But nonetheless, now that we can approach it without the burden of expectations, it's easier to see it for what it is. An ambitious and incredibly charming game that tried to live up to impossible expectations. And yet, while it failed in some ways, it greatly benefited Tekken as a whole by introducing new concepts, expanding the lore, and giving Namco the experience they needed to push the franchise in the right direction. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and see you next time.